On today's Prophecy in the News, we're going to take a look at chapters 11 and 12 of the book of Revelation. These are the defining chapters, I think, of the entire book. Gary Stearman is here to discuss with me Revealing Revelation.
Thanks, J.R. Well, men down through the ages have attempted to understand the book of Revelation. One of the most difficult aspects of Revelation is the timing problem, because we have 7 seals, 7 trumpets, 7 vials of wrath, and we ask ourselves, do these overlap? Do they take place in the first half, the second half of the tribulation? What is the ordering principle? On our last program, we attempted to convey the fact that we believe that John, the Revelator, was seeing these events from a timeless stance. That is, he was standing outside of the time and space in which we are locked. And as he did this, he was given certain things to witness. Now, he was able to witness in a timeless fashion the beginning, the middle, and the end of the tribulation. And then when he came back and reported to us, J.R., in other words, he wrote all this down, he's back in time and space again, so he has to put it all down in a kind of a sequential order. That doesn't mean that it happened in precisely that lockstep order. It is as though we have pictures, some of which overlap, some of which do not. And what we have is an eternal perspective here. Now, we are located in our study between the 6th and the 7th trumpet. Trumpets, very important.
Now, as we look at the trumpets, we must realize that they are the most significant of all of the symbols of the book of Revelation. This is a trumpets book, Gary.
Yes.
Everywhere we see the end time, the resurrection and so on, and other prophetic portions of the Bible, we always hear about the trumpet. You know, it was the Apostle Paul who said, "For the Lord himself shall descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of the archangel, and with the trumpet of God." Mm-hmm. And he also talks in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 about the last trumpet.
Sure.
Now, this, of course, takes us to Rosh Hashanah and the festival of trumpets. And these 7 trumpets, then, are defining the, basically the time zones here, the time sequences. And for example, we know the seals are from Pentecost to the end of the church age. Mm-hmm. And we know, I'm sorry, the 7 letters. And then the seals are culminating events. Even when John wrote, for example, the spirit of Antichrist was already rampant in the days of the Roman Empire, which means that the Roman Empire is going to be revived for the last days.
Sure.
And so it's sort of a culminating series of events. When you get to trumpets, it's the tribulation period.
It is indeed, and there's something interesting about trumpets, also called Rosh Hashanah. The festival of the trumpets has a very specific observance. Alfred Edersheim, in his book The Temple, noted that during the Feast of Trumpets, while the drink offering of the festive sacrifice was poured out, the priests and the Levites chanted Psalm 81. Well, J.R., this is a psalm that is dedicated to Israel's deliverance from Egypt in spite of Israel's disobedience. In other words, by his grace, God brought the people out. And we have here in verse 10 of Psalm 81, "I am the Lord thy God, which brought thee out of the land of Egypt. Open thy mouth wide, and I will fill it. But my people would not hearken to my voice, and Israel would have none of me." Edersheim points out that nevertheless, God delivered them from Egypt. Well, this is exactly the theme we have in Revelation. That is, Israel is delivered out of spiritual Egypt, which of course is the world system. And then also, Psalm 29 was sung at the very same time. And Psalm 29 has 7 voices of God, the first of which is in verse 3, "The voice of the Lord is upon the waters. The glory of God thundereth." And then there are 6 other references to the voice of God. Well, this takes us to the book of Revelation.
and chapter 10, and the 7 thunders that uttered their voices.
Exactly.
And so we have a distinct Rosh Hashanah flavor to this series of events. When we get over to the vials of wrath, we have Yom Kippur events. For it was the high priest on the Day of Atonement who, after taking the blood, first he creates smoke inside the Holy of Holies, and then his second trip he takes the blood of the bull, and then his third trip he takes the blood of the goat, sprinkles it on the mercy seat, and he comes back out of the Holy of Holies and he mixes the blood of the bull with the blood of the goat and takes the vials out then to the brazen altar in the courtyard, and he dashes that blood against the base of the brazen altar. That's typical of the 7 vials of wrath, of the mixed blood, the avenging of the saints, both Jews and the church, yes, Gentile Christianity, against an unbelieving world and against the Antichrist system. That is distinctly Yom Kippur. But the events of the trumpets correlate perfectly with the events of the vials, which means that we cannot tell you exactly when they take place. They take place within the 7-year period. It's all the way from Rosh Hashanah to Yom Kippur, which is 10 days. We don't understand all of the significance of the timing there, but they must be overlapped.
Now, speaking of timing, that brings us to Revelation 11. Which is the center verse of the particular group of 7 we're talking about now. The seven chapters, the middle chapter being chapter 11. There was given to me a reed like unto a rod. An angel stood, saying, Rise and measure the temple of God and the altar, and them that worship therein. But the court which was without the temple leave out, measure it not, for it's given unto the Gentiles, and the holy city shall they tread under foot 42 months. And I will give power unto my 2 witnesses, and they shall prophesy 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth. Now we have here the activities of the 2 witnesses. This raises a specific timing question.
Yes. And Gary, I think that we're looking at the first half of the tribulation period here, and here's the reason why I think so. When the first trumpet is sounded, hail and fire mingled with blood are cast upon the earth. And when the when the vials are poured out, we have water turning to blood as well.
Yes.
Well, the 2 witnesses here have power to smite the earth with all the plagues, and one of them has power to, verse 6, turn water to blood. So I think we're looking at the first half of the tribulation period here.
And the 2 witnesses, of course, are lights in the lampstand. Zechariah chapter 4 refers to the 2 witnesses in that way. Also, we have the very closing verses of the Old Testament. Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. And he shall turn the heart of the fathers to the children, the heart of the children of the fathers, lest I come and smite the earth with a curse. These 2 verses, J.R., talk about smiting the earth with a curse, which is the very thing that happens during the days of the tribulation. Also, Elijah coming before the tribulation, which we believe to be 7 years in length, and prophesying, that is, preaching repentance, much in the way that John the Baptist did, turning the fathers, the hearts of the fathers to the children, vice versa. What we have then is, I believe, Elijah operating in conjunction with the 144,000 who are sealed, and meeting, by the way, great opposition in the process.
The rabbis believe Elijah will come bringing the Ark of the Covenant and the ashes of the red heifer and the implements for temple worship. And he will restore all things, including restoring the temple worship of Bible days. And for that reason, I think we would have to agree that this is first half of the tribulation period. The 42 months when the Gentiles are treading the city underfoot would seem like a United Nations peacekeeping force to keep the peace, strengthening or confirming the covenant of Daniel 9:27. And I think when we see the measuring of the temple, we have the tabernacle set up for temple worship. That's still all first half, isn't it?
It certainly is.
And there's more. We'll be back in just a moment. In Revelation chapter 11, we have the holy city being tread underfoot for 42 months, and 2 witnesses witnessing for 1,260 days, the same time period. In chapter 12, we have the woman Israel fleeing into the wilderness for 1,260 days, and in chapter 13, verse 5, we have the beast given power to continue 42 months. Now, these could possibly be the same time period, last half of the tribulation period. And though we cannot be dogmatic on this, I feel that perhaps the holy city Jerusalem being tread underfoot for 42 months would be the first half of the tribulation period, followed by the power of the beast for the last 42 months, the last half of the tribulation period. And the 2 witnesses witnessing, and then the fleeing into the wilderness for the last half of the tribulation period. I think that's what it refers to here.
And it makes perfect sense if Elijah comes at the beginning of the tribulation. He's one of the 2 witnesses. We believe Moses is the other because in Egypt he had the power to turn water into blood, which is a very big tribulational event. Now, this being the case, what we have here is a perfect flowing picture of the coming of Elijah, the sealing of the 144,000, the rise of the Antichrist, with the 2 witnesses preaching against him all the way, with the activities of 144,000 in opposition to him all the way. And then we have the death of the 2 witnesses, J.R., which really does seem to be a mid-tribulational event.
You know, an interesting thing to me about all of this is that the United Nations is presently preparing to establish a one-world government. What is most significant is the meeting that's coming up in, for example, September of this year, when the United Nations is going to be discussing population growth, the ecology, the water systems being destroyed, as we looked at some weeks ago. And so it could very easily happen with the United Nations being the platform upon which this world government is established. Now let's look at the deaths of these 2 witnesses, Gary.
Yeah, when they have finished their testimony, this happens. Verse 7 says, "And when they shall have finished their testimony, the beast that ascendeth out of the bottomless pit shall make war against them, shall overcome them, and kill them." J.R., there's an interesting observation about this beast out of the bottomless pit.
Well, it could be Apollyon, the same one seen in chapter 9 we discussed on our last program.
On the other hand, traditionally, it's said to be the Antichrist himself. But whatever is going on, I believe, J.R., we have in the first half of the tribulation an ongoing, raging battle between the forces of darkness, even the demonic hordes being released, and the 2 witnesses. In other words, there is a pitched battle taking place during this whole period. And it ends when the world sees the 2 witnesses lying in the street, dead in the great city, verse 8. Their bodies, verse 9 of chapter 11, lie in the street 3.5 days. And then verse 11 says, "And after 3.5 days, the Spirit of life from God entered into them, and they stood upon their feet, and great fear fell upon them which saw them." Much has been made of this, and of course when they are killed, the people of the earth celebrate at their deaths. Some have said they'll probably be on worldwide TV. Who knows? Maybe MSNBC, maybe CNN. Their bodies will be shown. People will be celebrating this event, which means that the 2 witnesses are going to be seen by the world as evil, pure evil. And J.R., what this gives us a great clue as to the timing. I believe that at this point the people will be ready, totally ready in their own hearts to worship a false god. And of course the Lord refers to that, Daniel refers to it as the abomination of desolation.
Now, I want you to notice something that happens here. In the same hour that they are raptured into heaven, there is a great earthquake. A tenth part of the city fell, 7,000 people killed. The remnant were affrighted, gave glory to the God of heaven. We have the remnant still in Jerusalem at this point. They have not fled to the wilderness.
Yeah.
The second woe is past, and the third woe cometh quickly. Let me read to you very quickly the third woe. Therefore rejoice, ye heavens, and them that dwell in them. Woe to the inhabitants of the earth and of the sea, for the devil is come down unto you, having great wrath, because he knoweth he hath but a short time. He's kicked out of heaven. This is mid-tribulation here.
Certainly.
This is the middle of the tribulation period. He makes war with the woman, war with her remnant, and they flee to the wilderness then for the last half of the tribulation period, which is called times, and half a time, 1,260 days in chapter 12 and verse 6. Gary, we have in chapter 11, verse 3, 1,260 days, and we have in chapter 12, verse 6, 1,260 days. That's the first half, and the second half of the tribulation period pretty well marks it, doesn't it?
Yeah, and so we have 42 months marked out, first half, second half. Now we have 1,260 days marked out, first half, second half. It's as though the Lord is trying to tell us in more than one way of counting that the tribulation is 7 years long.
Then we have the seventh trumpet sounding in verse 15 of chapter 11, and it takes us then toward the last half of the tribulation period, the time when the Lord will come back. The nations will be angry, Armageddon will be fomented, and the temple of God, verse 19 says, the temple of God in heaven is opened, and we see the Ark of the Covenant. Gary, that is a Yom Kippur event, so we have gone from Rosh Hashanah to Yom Kippur.
We have headed toward the 10th day. Now, something's got to be said here at this point. Verse 14 of chapter 11 says, the third woe cometh quickly. The very next verse says the seventh angel sounded. Now, we have no gap here in Scripture between the third woe coming and the sounding of the seventh trumpet. But that doesn't mean that just because there's no space in the text, that there's no space in real time. In real time, apparently there's quite a long interval between the middle of the tribulation and the blowing of the seventh trumpet.
Now, it is commonly believed that with the seventh seal comes the seven trumpets, and with the seventh trumpet comes the seven vials. But we really don't have the opening of the seventh trumpet connected to the seven vials. They're several chapters apart here.
Mm-hmm. They are, and there seems to be, as we've suggested, considerable overlap. However, remember, we're talking about the Feast of Trumpets. The Feast of Trumpets, Rosh Hashanah, the 10 days of awe, culminating in Yom Kippur, and on that day, of course, it is the holiest day in the whole calendar. It's a time of crucial self-examination, and that's exactly what we have in Revelation.
Right. Now, when we get to chapter 12, we have a parenthetical portion of Scripture here, and it opens with a woman clothed with the sun, the moon under her feet. Gary, that's Rosh Hashanah.
It certainly is. And tell them how that, by the way, this doesn't seem like Rosh Hashanah, but it is.
So we have gone back to the beginning of everything again, with a return. We have the woman bringing forth, travailing in birth, pain to be delivered, and then the great red dragon, which of course is typical of Scorpio, with the red star in his chest, waiting to kill the child as soon as it was born. Of course, this takes us back 2,000 years to Bethlehem, and then brings us forward in time to the woman being Israel.
And we have spoken before of the woman as being represented in the divine celestial calendar. J.A. Seiss and others have pointed out how this woman literally lies in the calendar at the time of year of Rosh Hashanah. She's Virgo, the Virgin.
Yes. And it's a September event here.
Again.
Just absolutely a September event. The sun is always in Virgo in September.
That's right.
So this is a Rosh Hashanah event that quickly is going to move us then to Yom Kippur, 10 days later as we see the second coming of Christ. So the child is born, that's Bethlehem, caught up unto God to his throne, that's Acts chapter 1. And then in verse 6 we have the woman fleeing into the wilderness. That takes us 2,000 years into the future to the abomination of desolation, to the war against the saints by the dragon. She goes into the wilderness. So the time sequence here is not clear, but according to the context, it is clear.
Yes. And this brings us then to the end of the 12th chapter, because in verses 13 through 17, we have the dragon being cast into the earth, making war against the woman who brought forth the man-child. Clearly, that's Israel, and it's all 12 tribes. And we have her fleeing into the wilderness, verse 14, for a time, times, and half a time from the face of the serpent. What are those times that we're talking about here? 3.5 years.
3.5 years, and that takes us back to Daniel as well. Remember Daniel chapter 12, at that time shall Michael stand up. So we have Michael here in verse 7 and his angels fighting against the dragon and his angels. So this is obviously the tribulation period, and the dragon is about to be cast out into the earth to begin the last half of the tribulation period.
Absolutely. And so what we have is a very clear affirmation of a 7-year tribulation period with 2 distinct halves.
The interesting thing, of course, about the 144,000 is they are fleeing to the wilderness for 3.5 years. We'll be back in just a moment.